Good evening, traveller, and welcome back. As always, I speak to you at midnight here in England, crafting this tale so that it might reach you by the next midnight, wherever you are in the world. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you? Tonight, we step away from battlefields, away from kings and empires, and into a quieter, more hidden world. A world of silken whispers and candlelit rooms. A world where power was traded not only in gold or steel, but in desire. This is the story of the courtesans, women who lived at the edge of society, yet shaped its very heart. They were called sinners and muses, outcasts and queens. They were feared, desired, envied, despised. And through them, we glimpse one of history's oldest truths, that sexuality, far from being private, has always been deeply political. But do not imagine romance. To live as a courtesan was to walk a knife's edge. Wealth and influence one night, poverty and disgrace the next. Admired in whispers, condemned in sermons, desired by kings, discarded by time. It was survival through wit, beauty and calculation. It was a life as fragile as glass and as dangerous as fire. So tonight, traveller, we will walk through temples and palaces, through the streets of Rome and Venice, through the salons of Paris and the gaslit alleys of Victorian London. We will meet women whose names echo still, and countless more whose stories were buried in silence. And in the end, we will ask, could you have survived as a courtesan? Chapter 1. The Ancient Origins. Imagine yourself in the heart of Mesopotamia, thousands of years before Christ. The ziggurat rises like a mountain of stone, its steps leading toward the sky. At its summit waits not only a god, but a ritual. Here, sexuality is not yet condemned, it is sanctified. Among the Sumerians and Babylonians, sacred prostitution was woven into the fabric of worship. Women served in temples as intermediaries between the human and the divine, their bodies seen not as shameful, but as vessels of blessing. To lie with such a woman was to touch the gods themselves. Desire was not sin, it was prayer, and yet even in this earliest form, there is tension. Some saw these women as holy, others as tainted. The line between reverence and contempt blurred, as it would for centuries to come. Already the courtesan bore two faces, muse and outcast, saint and sinner. In Greece, the courtesan gained a new name, hetaira. Unlike the common prostitutes who worked the streets or brothels, the hetairai were companions to philosophers, artists, generals. They were educated, witty, skilled not only in love, but in conversation, music and politics. Men sought them not merely for their bodies, but for their minds. Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, was whispered to have influenced the politics of Athens itself. She was seen as both scandalous and brilliant, a woman who blurred the boundaries of what was permitted, who dared to be both lover and intellectual equal. For the Greeks, the courtesan was a paradox. She was both necessary and dangerous, admired and condemned. To be a hetaira was to live outside the strict confines of wife and mother, to taste freedom, but always at the cost of social exile. And then Rome. Here, the courtesan took on another form. In the lupanaria, the state-regulated brothels, sex was a commodity, catalogued and taxed. But above these streets walked women of higher standing, mistresses and companions to senators, poets, emperors. Some wielded influence through their lovers, their names tied to scandals that rippled through the empire. But the Romans, like the Greeks, carried ambivalence in their blood. They consumed desire with one hand, condemned it with the other. The courtesan was pleasure and threat in equal measure. From these beginnings, a pattern was born. Every society needed courtesans, and every society hated them. They embodied what was forbidden yet irresistible. They lived in candlelit rooms, yet cast shadows that reached palaces and thrones. And so, from temples to city streets, The courtesan began her long journey through history, never fully accepted, never fully erased. The Empire of Rome was built on conquest, on order, on the weight of laws etched into stone. And yet, beneath its marble forums and marching legions, desire pulsed like blood in the veins of the city. The Romans did not deny it. They codified it, taxed it, made it part of the machinery of empire. Walk the streets of Pompeii, traveler, and the truth is carved into the walls. Faded frescoes of lovers entwined, crude graffiti listing names and prices, phallic charms hung above doorways for luck. Brothels, lupanaria, stood at the heart of neighborhoods, their rooms small, their walls painted with instructions of pleasure. Desire was a trade, no different than bread or oil, its workers as much a part of the city as merchants or bakers. And yet not all women of pleasure were the same. Some were slaves, bodies bought and sold without consent. Others were freed women who chose survival in the brothel rather than hunger in the streets. These women lived hard, short lives, their names forgotten as quickly as their youth faded. But there were others. At the higher rungs of Roman society, courtesans moved in different circles. They were not hidden in cramped rooms, but seen on the arms of senators, poets, even emperors. Their role was not only physical, but political. Their presence at banquets and salons, shaping reputations, alliances, scandals. The poet Ovid wrote of them, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in mockery. Martial, Juvenal, and others sneered at the wives of noblemen, while celebrating the wit and allure of courtesans who could charm and ruin with equal ease. These women were not mere shadows. They were muses, sparring partners in wit, participants in the city's intellectual and artistic life. But admiration was always double-edged. Roman society, like Greek before it, divided women into rigid categories: the respectable wife, bound to household and childbearing, and the dishonored woman, who lived outside those walls. A courtesan could be admired for her beauty, her cleverness, her influence, but never truly respected. She was always other, a woman of power, yet never allowed legitimacy. And still she endured, because in a world ruled by men, she carved a space where her voice could be heard, her choices, however limited, her own. She lived dangerously, yes, but she lived vividly. Consider how fragile her position truly was. A senator's favor could lift her into wealth, jewels glittering at her throat, villas offered as gifts. But just as quickly, a rumor could destroy her. An emperor's mistress could wield influence in whispers behind palace doors, but if politics turned against her, exile, or worse, awaited. Desire gave power, but it was a power that burned as easily as it shone. Rome was an empire of contradictions. It celebrated indulgence but preached morality, consumed pleasure but punished women who embodied it. Courtesans lived at the center of this paradox. They were a mirror in which Rome saw its own hunger, its own hypocrisy. When the empire finally crumbled, when its marble fell to ruin and its roads broke into dust, the courtesan did not vanish. She shifted, transformed, reappeared in new cities, new languages, new guises. Because wherever power and desire walked hand in hand, she was never far behind. The empire of Rome collapses into fragments, and with it the world tilts toward a new age. Castles rise where forums once stood, cathedrals pierce the sky where temples had crumbled. The Middle Ages are born, and with them a new tension between the sacred and the forbidden. In sermons, priests thunder against lust, condemning it as sin. In law, rulers proclaim chastity and purity as virtues of order. And yet behind monastery walls and city gates, desire does not vanish. It retreats into shadow. It reshapes itself to survive. Walk through the narrow streets of medieval Paris or Florence, and you will see it. The brothels stand openly, marked by lanterns or symbols, tolerated by kings and bishops alike. For all their sermons, the church often preferred control to eradication. Better to contain sin within walls than allow it to roam freely. Better to tax it, regulate it, profit from it. In many cities, prostitution was legal, even supervised. Women wore specific clothing to mark their trade, forbidden silks or colored bands that set them apart. They were both necessary and despised, welcomed for men's pleasure, shunned in public life. Their presence was a contradiction the city lived with, because it could not live without them. But the courtesan, the higher class of this hidden world, took on a different shape. In the Italian city-states, especially Venice and Florence, she rose into a figure of elegance and danger. She was not merely a body for hire, but a companion of wit, poetry, and music. She learned languages, read philosophy, recited verse. She entertained not in taverns, but in salons, candlelit rooms where power and desire mingled freely. In Venice, the courtesan became almost a symbol of the city itself, mysterious, alluring, decadent. Sailors and merchants brought riches from the east, and with them came the wealth to sustain women whose allure was not only physical but intellectual. Their names appeared in letters, in poetry, sometimes even in diplomatic gossip. And yet, the risks were immense. The line between courtesan and prostitute was perilously thin, and society's tolerance could vanish in an instant. A courtesan might dine with nobles one night, then face exile or punishment the next if she offended the wrong patron. Moral panics flared, fueled by plague, famine, or the anger of priests, and women who once glittered in candlelight were suddenly cast as scapegoats. The medieval world was cruelly fragile. War, disease, and poverty stalked every corner. For a courtesan, survival meant constant balance. Beauty against suspicion, wit against jealousy, charm against danger. She had to be more than alluring, she had to be indispensable. But still, they endured. Still, their names whispered through the alleyways and courts. Still, their shadows lingered in paintings and poetry. Because, in a world that tried to silence women, the courtesan found a way to speak. She made her body a stage, her mind a weapon, her survival a kind of quiet rebellion. And though the Middle Ages buried much in darkness, the courtesan was a flame that refused to go out. The Middle Ages fade, and Europe awakens. Cathedrals no longer only rise for God, but palaces bloom for men. Painters capture faces in oil, poets fill pages with verse, scholars rediscover the wisdom of Greece and Rome. The Renaissance is a rebirth, a celebration of beauty, learning, and human desire. And into this world, the courtesan steps not as shadow, but as flame. In Venice, the courtesan becomes a figure of power and fame. The canals glitter with palaces where merchants and nobles host banquets of impossible luxury. Amid the music and wine, among the paintings of Titian and the poems of Ariosto, the courtesan sits, equal to kings and poets, mistress of wit as much as of body. Here she is not merely tolerated, she is celebrated. Her beauty is framed not as sin but as art. Her intellect is cultivated. Her voice heard in salons where politics and philosophy mix with passion. She is no longer only a companion, she is a muse, an influencer of her age. One name rises above the rest: Veronica Franco, poet and courtesan of 16th century Venice. She was more than an ornament at banquets. She wrote sonnets that burn with sharpness and truth, verses that answered men's scorn with wit and pride. She spoke openly of women's worth, of love's contradictions, of the hypocrisy of a society that consumed her yet condemned her. For a time, she moved in circles of immense power, admired by nobles, envied by rivals. Her poetry survives still, carrying her voice across centuries, but her life also shows the cost. When Venice turned against her, when enemies sought to ruin her, she was accused of witchcraft, dragged before the Inquisition. Though she survived, her wealth and fame crumbled. The courtesan's crown was always fragile, and hers was no exception. Elsewhere in Italy and France, others shone just as brightly. Courtesans became patrons of the arts, protectors of poets, confidants of princes. They shaped fashion, set trends, wielded influence from behind the curtain. They blurred the line between mistress and queen, between ornament and authority. But always the paradox remained. Their power was undeniable, yet it rested on foundations of sand. Admiration one night, ruin the next. Wealth at the mercy of patrons. Fame shadowed by danger, and yet the Renaissance courtesan changed history. She proved that women, even in a world that sought to bind them, could step into spheres of art, politics, and culture. She embodied beauty, yes, but also intellect and voice. She forced society to see her not only as body, but as mind. The Renaissance gave her a stage. She played her role brilliantly. But the price of the spotlight was always risk. The brighter the flame, the sooner it threatened to burn out. The stage shifts now to France, where kings live like gods, and their courts glitter brighter than the sun. Versailles, Fontainebleau, Paris salons, all become theatres of wealth and intrigue. And in the wings of this theatre stand the courtesans, stepping forward not merely as companions, but as forces that bend politics and history. In the 16th century, royal mistresses begin to rise in prominence. They are no longer whispered scandals, but public figures, acknowledged, even honoured, for their place beside the throne. They shape fashion, set trends, dictate the rhythms of courtly life. For some, their beauty and wit rival the power of queens themselves. One of the earliest was Diane de Poitiers, the beloved of King Henry II. Elegant, refined, she was not only his lover but his advisor, his confidant, his constant presence. Her influence reached into politics, into the very symbols of power. She shared the royal monogram, entwining her initials with the king's, stamped upon palaces and coins, a courtesan elevated to near queenly status, her name forever tied to the French crown. Later, the role grows still more powerful. By the time of Louis XIV, the Sun King, mistresses like Madame de Montespan ruled courtly fashion and politics alike. Her apartments in Versailles rivaled those of queens. Her words swayed ministers, her smile opened or closed fortunes. She was both celebrated and feared, a woman whose influence seemed limitless. Yet even at the height of glory, danger lurked. Accusations of witchcraft, of poison, of intrigue whispered in the corridors, and when favor waned, exile came swiftly. Montespan, once adored, was eventually cast aside, her name tarnished. For a courtesan, proximity to the throne meant power, but it also meant peril. By the 18th century, the age of courtesans and mistresses reached a fevered peak. Names like Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry entered history not just as companions of Louis XV, but as patrons of the arts, shapers of diplomacy, arbiters of style. Pompadour especially left a legacy beyond desire. She supported Voltaire, protected philosophers of the Enlightenment, commissioned architecture and art that shaped the look of Paris itself. She proved that a courtesan could be more than ornament. She could be architect of culture, but Pompadour too knew the fragility of her place. Though she was admired by many, she was loathed by others, accused of draining the king's attention, blamed for failures in war and politics. For all her wit and vision, she remained defined by her role as mistress. The crown glittered, but it was never secure. To walk the halls of Versailles as a courtesan was to embody power dressed in silk. Your presence might sway kings, your beauty might dictate the fate of nobles, but every smile, every word, every gown carried risk. For in the end, your authority was borrowed, your wealth conditional, your life tethered to the fickle heart of a king. And so, once more, we see the paradox. Courtesans in France reached heights no woman of their time was meant to reach, yet they were always shadows of the men they served, never permitted to stand wholly in the light. The 18th century fades into revolution and empire, and by the 19th, a new order rises. It is the age of industry, of railways and gaslight, of steamships and telegraphs. It is also the age of Queen Victoria, whose reign defines an era obsessed with morality, purity, and appearances. On the surface, the Victorian world preaches restraint, sermons thunder against lust, newspapers praise domestic virtue, and novels extol the angelic wife and mother as the moral heart of society. Respectability becomes a kind of armor, and propriety is the measure of worth. And yet, behind the curtains, in gaslit alleys and gilded drawing rooms, desire thrives more openly than ever. For the stricter the surface, the deeper the shadow. The courtesan of the Victorian age lives within this contradiction, condemned in public, celebrated in secret, desired in silence. London itself is a city of two faces. By day, it is the empire's beating heart, filled with factories, banks, and endless crowds. By night, it becomes something else. The West End glitters with theatres and salons, where courtesans, known as demi-mondaines, dine with politicians, artists, and aristocrats. They dress in silks from Paris, wear diamonds bought with whispered promises, and ride in carriages finer than those of many noblewomen. Meanwhile, only a few streets away, the East End sinks into darkness. Here, prostitution explodes on an unimaginable scale. Brothels crowd every alley, women line the streets, and hunger drives countless young girls into the trade. In the 1850s, London's sex trade was so vast that reformers claimed 1 in every 12 women in the city lived by it. Thus, the Victorian courtesan exists on a knife's edge between two worlds: luxury and ruin, diamonds and disease, worship and disdain. Famous names glitter in this age. Cora Pearl, with her flame-coloured hair, became the toast of Paris and London, her presence turning heads in every ballroom. Harriet Wilson, earlier in the century, dared to publish her memoirs, exposing her lovers, dukes, princes, even the Duke of Wellington himself, scandalizing all of England. These women lived boldly, refusing to vanish into shadows, carving their names into history with charm and defiance. Yet for every Cora Pearl, thousands more lived forgotten lives in the East End, prey to poverty, violence, and disease. The Victorian fascination with morality did little to save them. Laws cracked down, sermons condemned, but the demand never faltered. Desire does not obey law, and hypocrisy thrived in the gaslit gloom. The courtesan of this era, then, was more than a companion. She was an actress upon society's greatest stage. She performed wealth, wit, and beauty for audiences who simultaneously adored and despised her. She existed as both scandal and spectacle, tolerated because she reflected the very contradictions of the Victorian heart. For beneath all the speeches of purity, beneath all the sermons of restraint, the truth was simple. The empire ran on hunger, hunger for power, hunger for wealth, hunger for flesh. And the courtesan, as always, stood at the crossroads of desire and survival. Through every age, from temple to palace, from salon to gaslit street, one truth emerges. The courtesan was never only an ornament. She was power embodied in a form society could not openly admit, yet could never truly suppress. Power for the courtesan came first through beauty, yes. But beauty was fleeting, fragile. What mattered more was wit, memory, intelligence. A courtesan who could not entertain a king's mind or match a poet's word was soon forgotten, but one who could charm both mind and body became indispensable. In Renaissance Venice, Veronica Franco sharpened her power with poetry, her verses cutting down those who mocked her. In France, Madame de Pompadour wielded charm as a tool of politics, whispering advice that shaped treaties and war. In Rome, long before them, the companions of senators and emperors shifted alliances with a glance, a smile, a rumor. They were never queens, yet they could unmake queens. Never ministers, yet they could sway ministers. Never soldiers, Yet they could start wars in bedrooms and end them at banquets. But the power of courtesans was never secure. It rested on the favor of men, on the whispers of rivals, on the shifting tides of scandal. A courtesan could rise to glitter in jewels and silks, then fall into exile or ruin overnight. Every triumph was shadowed by peril, every alliance was a wager, and yet in their dangerous world, courtesans became survivors of extraordinary resilience. They learned languages to charm foreign nobles, memorized poetry to match philosophers, mastered fashion to outshine rivals. They turned themselves into works of art, living sculptures carved out of wit, hunger, and ambition. Their power was also symbolic. They embodied what societies most feared and desired, women who could not be controlled. Men could buy their company, but not always their loyalty. Kings could love them, but not silence them. Priests could condemn them, but never erase them. They stood as reminders that desire itself is power, and that to control desire is impossible. Think of it this way. The courtesan was a mirror. In her, men saw their own hunger, their own hypocrisy, their own weakness. She reflected back the truths society tried hardest to deny, and for that, she was both hated and adored. To speak of courtesans, then, is not only to tell the story of women surviving through beauty and wit. It is to tell the story of power in disguise. A power fragile, fleeting but undeniable. A power society feared even as it sought it out. And it is why, even now, centuries later, their names are still whispered. The courtesan has always been more than a woman of flesh and blood. She is an idea, an image, an archetype that societies return to again and again. Desire made visible, danger dressed in silk, freedom embodied and yet forever punished. In myth and literature, the courtesan often appears as the femme fatale, the woman whose beauty ensnares, whose love destroys, whose presence unmans even the strongest of men. She is Cleopatra with her barge of gold, luring Antony to his doom. She is Helen of Troy, whose face launched 1,000 ships. She is Salome, dancing for the head of John the Baptist. To poets and painters she was muse. To priests and rulers she was warning. One image exalted, the other condemned. Both simplified, both powerful. The courtesan became not just a person, but a stage upon which men projected their deepest fears and desires. Symbolically, she represented freedom from the narrow cage of womanhood. While wives were bound to obedience, courtesans chose companions, traveled cities, shaped conversations. They lived outside the household, outside the rules. That freedom made them fascinating and terrifying, because to men, the courtesan was proof of what women could be if allowed to step beyond control. Clever, ambitious, commanding, influential. And so societies dressed her in both admiration and shame, using her as a lesson, a flame that draws the eye, but burns those who come too close. The symbolism of the courtesan also carried moral weight. She was temptation embodied, the serpent in silk, the reason for downfall. How many sermons warned that kingdoms fell through the weakness of kings, undone by a courtesan's embrace? How many laws were written not to control men's hunger, but to punish the women who made it visible? And yet, despite centuries of scorn, the courtesan never disappeared, because she was needed. She allowed society to maintain its illusions, the wife for respectability, the courtesan for passion, the one to uphold order, the other to absorb chaos. In truth, she was the pressure valve for human contradiction, ensuring both survival and scandal. In art, she became eternal. Paintings of the Renaissance glorified her beauty. Novels of the 19th century mourned her fall. Think of Dumas' La Dame aux Camélias, the courtesan Marguerite, doomed by love and illness. Her story echoing into Verdi's La Traviata. Even in fiction, she was always the paradox, desired, destroyed, immortalized. So when you think of the courtesan, do not imagine only a woman behind a closed door. Imagine instead the myth she carried, Muse and monster, freedom and ruin, angel and demon. She was the shadow in which a society's own secrets lived. And in that shadow, she held more power than most ever admitted. The story has carried us from temples of Mesopotamia to the streets of Rome, from Venetian salons to Versailles, from the glitter of Paris to the gaslit nights of London. Everywhere the courtesan has appeared, changing her dress, her language, her role, but never her essence. She was always the same paradox, desired and despised, celebrated and condemned, free yet never safe. And now, traveler, it is time to ask the question we have asked so many times before. Could you have survived? At first, the answer seems simple. To live as a courtesan was to eat better than the starving, to wear silks when others wore rags, to dine in candle-lit halls while peasants toiled in the fields. From the outside, it looks like fortune, a life of luxury bought by charm and beauty. But look closer. The courtesan's life was never truly her own. Every gift was borrowed, every jewel conditional, every smile balanced on a blade. A king's favor could lift her high, but his whim could cast her into exile overnight. A patron's protection might shield her, but a whisper of scandal could destroy her. To survive meant constant vigilance, constant reinvention, constant fear. Worse still was the cost beneath the surface. The courtesan was never simply a woman. She was a symbol, a fantasy, an archetype that others projected onto her. Her true self, the tired body, the quiet dreams, the private griefs, was swallowed by the mask she was forced to wear. To be desired was not to be seen, and to be seen was to risk ruin. Could you endure that? Could you live as a performance every hour of your life? Could you risk everything for beauty that fades, for power that rests not in your hands, but in the hands of those who consume you? The courtesans of history endured it because they had to. For some, it was survival against poverty. For others, it was a chance at influence in a world that gave women little. But the cost was always high. Many died in obscurity, forgotten once their youth dimmed. Others ended in scandal, their names spat out by the very mouths that once praised them. Few ever found peace. And yet, for all this, they left a mark that cannot be erased. They inspired art, shaped politics, whispered in the ears of kings, challenged the hypocrisy of their times. They proved that even when silenced, women could find ways to speak, that even when chained by desire and shame, they could still shape history. So, no, you could not survive as a courtesan, not because you lack beauty or wit or courage, but because the life itself was designed to consume. It devoured those who lived it, even as it immortalized them. Thank you, traveler, for walking this long and dangerous road with me tonight. Before we part, I ask, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it for you? Could you have survived, even for a season, as a courtesan in history? Rest now. The candles are extinguished, the salons are silent, the jeweled whispers fade into darkness. Another midnight will bring us another journey, another secret, another saga. Until then, sleep deeply, dream safely, and remember, even in shadows, power leaves its trace.